The rain had been falling since before dawn, spreading a grey mist across the Tennessee hills. It came softly at first, then harder, washing the dust from the narrow road that wound between old oak trees and forgotten fences. At the end of that road stood a chapel no one had entered for years. Its wooden cross leaned slightly to one side, and vines had climbed so high that they covered half the front window. The sound of rain against the roof mixed with the distant cry of a crow, and the world seemed suspended in stillness. Florence arrived there carrying a small suitcase, her coat soaked and her breath trembling from the cold. She had walked for hours without looking back. Behind her lay the life she could no longer bear to live. The town where she once baked bread for her neighbors and sat every Sunday in the third pew had become a place of whispers and pity. People had stopped meeting her eyes after her husband's death, as if sorrow were something contagious. Her home had turned hollow, each room echoing memories she could not stand to hear. When the final letter arrived from the bank, telling her the house would no longer be hers, Florence packed what little she owned and left before sunrise. She did not know where she was going, only that the road led away from everything that hurt. The chapel appeared to her through the rain, like a shelter forgotten by time. Its door was partly open, hanging from rusted hinges. Inside, the air was thick with dust, and the faint scent of burned candles long melted into wax. She crossed the threshold carefully, as if stepping into sacred ground. Her shoes made soft marks on the wooden floor, and the silence seemed to welcome her. It was not a silence of fear, but of memory, the kind that holds the past rather than hides it. She placed her suitcase on a bench near the entrance and sat down, listening to the wind brushing against the stained glass windows. Each color reflected across her face like pieces of broken sunlight. She felt both small and safe in that place. The rain outside grew heavier, its rhythm steady like a prayer repeated through generations. For the first time in months, Florence allowed herself to rest. Her body ached from the long walk, but her heart ached even more from the years of pretending she was fine. In that stillness, memories came uninvited. She remembered her husband, Thomas, standing at the doorway of their farmhouse on another rainy afternoon. He had a way of holding his hat in his hands, as if it was something fragile. He used to hum while fixing things around the house, a habit she missed more than she could say. The day he fell ill, the sound of his humming stopped, and so did the music of their life. The world moved on, but she remained anchored to that silence. As the wind pressed against the chapel walls, Florence looked toward the altar. Dust had gathered on the wooden rail, and an old Bible lay open, as if someone had left it waiting for her. She rose slowly, her knees stiff from the cold, and walked down the aisle. Every step echoed faintly, mixing with the rhythm of the rain. When she reached the altar, she touched the Bible with trembling fingers. Its pages were yellowed, but the words were still clear. She read without thinking, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." The verse pierced her quietly. She closed the book and let out a breath she did not know she was holding. It had been so long since she felt that someone might still see her as more than a widow or a burden. For months she had spoken only to strangers at the market and to the wind that passed through the broken windows of her house. Now, in this abandoned chapel, she felt watched but not judged. There was a calmness that filled the air, something that whispered of forgiveness she had never dared to ask for. She decided to stay, at least until the rain stopped. In one of the side rooms, she found a few old blankets, a candle, and a wooden chair missing one leg. The roof leaked near the corner, but the floor was dry enough for her to lie down. She wrapped herself in the blanket and listened to the storm as night fell. The candlelight flickered on the walls, creating shapes that looked almost alive. She thought she saw movement in the reflection of the window, but when she turned, nothing was there. Only her shadow stretched long across the floor. Sleep came slowly, mixed with dreams that felt too close to memory. She saw her husband's smile, the shape of his hands, the field behind their house glowing with evening light. Then she saw something else, a figure standing by a door she did not recognize, watching her with sadness in his eyes. When she woke, the candle had burned out, and only the sound of dripping water filled the room. For a moment, she could not tell if she was still dreaming. The morning light crept through the cracks in the wall. Florence rose, brushed off the dust from her coat, and stepped into the chapel again. The storm had passed, leaving the air damp and cool. She opened the door slightly, breathing in the scent of wet earth. The world outside looked washed clean, as if even sorrow had been rinsed away for a while. She thought of leaving, but found herself unable to cross the threshold. The chapel had become more than shelter. It was now a pause between what had been and what might still come. She spent the next hours cleaning. The benches were covered in cobwebs, the altar cloth torn and faded. She found a broom behind the pulpit and began sweeping slowly, one corner at a time. There was something healing about it, the steady rhythm of work and the quiet satisfaction of order returning to forgotten places. As she swept, she imagined the people who once prayed here, families, farmers, children singing hymns on Sunday mornings. Their voices seemed to linger faintly in the walls, and she could almost hear them again. By afternoon, the chapel looked less abandoned. Florence lit another candle and placed it near the altar. Its small flame brought warmth that felt larger than the room itself. She sat on the front bench and let her mind wander. Was this what she had been searching for? Not a house or a town, but peace. A place where no one asked her to smile when she could barely breathe. A place where silence did not hurt. As the light dimmed, she realized how alone she truly was. Not lonely in the sense of wanting company, but in the deep awareness that life had moved on without her. The fields outside would grow again, children would laugh in towns she would never visit, and the world would keep spinning as if her pain had never existed, yet she was still here, breathing, cleaning, remembering. Perhaps that was enough. When evening came, she decided to stay one more night. The candle burned low, and she sat watching its glow. The sound of crickets filled the air outside, blending with the faint rustle of leaves. She closed her eyes, grateful for the quiet. Then, in the middle of that calm, she heard something, a soft creak of wood near the altar. Her eyes opened. The candle flame trembled. She listened closely. Another sound followed, heavier this time, like a footstep. Her breath caught. She turned toward the altar, but the shadows made it hard to see. The chapel had been empty since she arrived. She was certain of it. The sound came again, slower, deliberate, moving across the front of the room. Florence stood frozen, her hands gripping the bench. Her mind tried to reason. It could be an animal, the wood shifting, the wind. But the rhythm was too human, too measured. The air grew colder. She stepped forward, her heart pounding against her chest. The candle flickered and went out, leaving her in near darkness. Only the faint moonlight through the stained glass painted the altar in pale colors. There it was again, a single, heavy step, right where the Bible had been left open. Florence whispered a prayer under her breath, not from fear, but from instinct. She had nowhere else to go, no one waiting for her. Whatever was in that chapel, she would face it. The silence stretched until the night felt endless. Then came one more step, clear and slow, as if someone or something wanted her to know she was not alone. She stood there, motionless, her eyes fixed on the altar. The shadows shifted, and the sound stopped. The chapel returned to stillness, but her heart would not calm. She waited, afraid to move, listening for the next sound that might confirm what she already feared. The night held its breath with her. Outside, the wind rose again, carrying the scent of wet earth and something older, something that did not belong to the world of the living. The night stretched long inside the chapel. Florence barely slept. Every creak of wood or whisper of wind seemed alive, carrying meaning she could not name. When dawn came, it was pale and uncertain, the kind of morning that looks like it's still deciding whether to exist. She sat near the altar, hands clasped, watching dust float in the thin light. There was no sign of whoever or whatever had walked there during the night, yet the unease remained, quiet but steady, like a question waiting for an answer. Outside, mist lingered across the hills, hiding the path that led back to town. She thought about leaving, but something inside her resisted. Maybe it was faith, or maybe just exhaustion. Either way, her feet stayed still. She decided to make tea with the last bit of water she carried and a small tin cup she found near the pulpit. The warm sip steadied her hands, though it did little to quiet her thoughts. As morning light spread through the stained glass, the chapel revealed details she had missed before. There were carvings on the wooden beams, tiny crosses, initials, dates. People had once loved this place enough to leave their mark. Florence traced one with her finger, the wood smooth beneath her touch. 1954, it read. She imagined a family sitting right there, perhaps on a bright Sunday morning, their voices filling the air. That thought brought comfort, as if their presence still lingered, protecting the walls from forgetting what they had been built for. She began to tidy again, not out of duty but need. When her life had collapsed, order was the first thing to vanish. Cleaning became her way of claiming space back from chaos. Each time the broom met the floor, she felt lighter, as if the weight she carried could be swept into corners and left behind. By noon, she had cleared the pews and uncovered a small wooden plaque nailed near the back. It read, St. Mark's Chapel. Let all who are lost find rest. The words felt personal. Lost, rest. Two things that had defined her days. She sat down before the plaque and stayed there until her heartbeat slowed. The air was cool, scented with damp wood and candle smoke. Somewhere in the distance, a bell rang, perhaps from a farm or a distant church still alive. It sounded like memory, faint but full of warmth. When the afternoon sun broke through the clouds, Florence stepped outside. The world shimmered with new color, the wet grass, the glistening bark, the puddles that reflected pieces of sky. She picked wildflowers from the roadside, more out of habit than purpose, and brought them back inside, arranging them near the altar. It wasn't much, but the chapel seemed to glow in appreciation. For a while, peace returned. She read a few pages from the old Bible, spoke softly to herself, and listened to the birds that had returned after the storm. She almost forgot about the footsteps. Almost. By evening, the wind began to rise again. The windows rattled faintly, and the branches outside scraped against the roof. Florence lit 2 candles instead of 1, and whispered a small prayer she remembered from childhood. It was not a plea for safety, but for clarity. She wanted to understand why she had been led here, why this place, and why now. The answer did not come in words, but in feeling, a soft, unshakable sense that she was not meant to leave yet, that something unfinished waited in the shadows of this chapel. She looked at the altar again. It stood quiet, the candlelight playing on its worn edges. She forced herself to breathe slowly, to believe the calm was real. Then came the sound again. This time it wasn't subtle. A clear, measured step echoed from the front of the chapel. Florence froze, her eyes darting toward the source. The candles flickered, and for a split second she thought she saw movement behind the altar rail. Her throat tightened, her pulse hammering. She called out softly, her voice barely above a whisper. No response, only silence, and then another step, closer. She gripped the pew for balance, torn between staying still and running. But something in the sound carried no threat. It wasn't the heavy tread of an intruder or the shuffle of an animal. It was careful, slow, almost hesitant. She forced herself to walk forward, each step deliberate. The air grew colder as she neared the altar. She reached the Bible again, half expecting it to move, but it lay undisturbed. The next sound didn't come from the floor this time. It came from above. The rafters creaked, and a small shower of dust drifted down. Florence looked up and caught sight of a shadow moving near the ceiling. Her heart leapt, but when she blinked, the shadow vanished. She stayed still for a long time, listening. The silence that followed was so complete, it made her ears ring. Then, slowly, she turned and walked back toward her bench, determined not to give in to fear. If she was meant to find something here, she would not run from it. The night deepened. She set another candle near her side and lay down again. Her thoughts wandered to her husband, to the nights they spent talking by the fire. He used to tell her that faith is not about seeing, but about trusting what you cannot see. She closed her eyes with that thought. When she woke again, it was still dark. The candles had burned low and the air was cold enough to see her breath, but she wasn't alone. She could feel it, the unmistakable sense of another presence in the room. She sat up slowly. Her eyes adjusted to the dark, and there near the altar, a faint light flickered. Not candlelight, not reflection, but something softer, pulsing faintly like breath. Florence rose to her feet, drawn forward. The boards beneath her creaked in rhythm with her steps. As she approached, the light dimmed, then brightened again. illuminating the floorboards behind the altar. She hesitated, then knelt to look closer. The wood there looked different, newer, cleaner, as if someone had replaced it not long ago. She pressed her hand against it, and it gave slightly beneath her weight. Something hollow echoed underneath. Her heart began to race. She looked around, searching for a tool, and found a loose piece of iron near the side door. Using it, she pried at the edge of the board until it lifted with a groan. Underneath lay a small compartment, barely large enough to hold a box. The faint light she had seen seemed to come from within it. She reached down, her fingers trembling, and pulled out a wooden chest covered in dust. It was old, but not ancient, perhaps a few decades old. The light faded as soon as she touched it. Florence placed the chest on the altar and stared at it. Her breath quickened. The lock was rusted, weak from time. She tapped it gently with the iron tool until it snapped open. Inside was a folded piece of cloth, yellowed with age. Beneath it lay an envelope with her name written across the front. She froze. Her name, not another Florence, not a coincidence, her full name, written in careful, deliberate script. She felt the room spin. How could this be? She had never been here before, had never known this chapel existed. Her hands shook as she picked up the letter. The paper was brittle, but the ink still dark. She held it close to the candlelight and began to read. My dearest Florence, if you are reading this, then time has brought you where you needed to be. I prayed that one day you would find this place. What you lost was not taken, it was waiting. You must trust what is unseen and listen when the silence speaks. Do not fear the steps you hear. They belong to grace. She stopped reading, her throat tight. The handwriting was unmistakable. It was Thomas's. The letter fell from her hands. She staggered back, covering her mouth, eyes wide with disbelief. Every part of her wanted to deny what she saw, but the truth was there on the paper, the same curves of ink she had watched him write 100 times, her husband's words, reaching across the years, across death itself. She sank to her knees, tears slipping down her cheeks. The letter trembled in her hands as she read the rest, though she could barely see through the blur. You were never alone, my love. When the storms come, go to the place where prayers never die. I will be near as long as faith is stronger than fear. Florence pressed the letter to her heart. She did not know whether to laugh or cry. Somehow her husband had known she would come. Somehow this chapel had been waiting for her. She lifted her head, staring toward the altar. The shadows seemed softer now, the air warmer. The fear she felt earlier faded into awe. The footsteps, the flickering light, they weren't signs of danger. They were signs of presence. In that quiet, Florence whispered a thank you. The walls held her words like a promise. The candle's flame steadied, glowing brighter, and for the first time in years, her heart felt light enough to believe again. Where in the world are you watching from? Leave it down below in the comments. Florence stayed kneeling for a long time, unable to move. The candlelight trembled softly beside her, and the letter lay open across her hands like a bridge between two worlds. She traced her husband's name at the bottom of the page, half afraid it would fade if she blinked. The ink had bled slightly over the years, but the loops and lines were clear enough for her to recognize the way his hand always curved on the letter T. It was him. There was no doubt. The air around her felt charged, alive with something she could not see, but could almost feel pressing against her skin. It wasn't fear this time. It was presence, gentle, steady, and familiar. She looked around the chapel, half expecting to see him standing in the aisle, smiling the way he used to after a long day. But the room remained still. Only the rainwater dripping through the roof broke the silence. Her eyes returned to the chest. Beneath the letter, another folded item rested inside. It was a photograph, curled at the edges but intact. Florence lifted it carefully. It showed a younger version of herself and Thomas, standing in front of their farmhouse, both smiling, her head resting against his shoulder. But there was something odd in the picture, a faint outline in the background that looked like the shape of the same chapel she was in now. She had never noticed it before. How could it be? A shiver ran through her, not from cold, but from realization. This place had always been part of her life, even before she knew it. Perhaps Thomas had come here once, years ago, and found comfort she was only now discovering. The thought filled her with warmth. Maybe this was where he had prayed when he knew his time was running out. Maybe this was the place he had chosen for her to find him again. She folded the letter and held it close. The tears that had burned her eyes earlier now fell freely, but they were not tears of grief. They were release. Each drop carried away a piece of the pain that had settled over her heart like dust. When she finally stood, her legs trembled, but her spirit felt steady for the first time in years. Florence walked to the front door of the chapel and opened it wide. The world outside glowed under the afternoon sun. The sky was clear, washed clean by the night storm, and the smell of wet earth filled her lungs. She stepped out and stood on the small porch, letting the light touch her face. She closed her eyes, lifting her chin slightly toward the warmth. For a moment, she imagined Thomas standing beside her, his hand resting gently over hers the way it used to. She whispered, "I found you," her voice quiet but firm. The breeze that swept through the hills answered with a soft rustle, carrying the sound of distant birds. It felt like an answer. She returned inside and placed the letter back into the chest, covering it again with the folded cloth. She set it on the altar, where the light from the stained glass painted it in shades of red and gold. Whatever force had brought her here had done what it came to do, but deep down she sensed that the story wasn't finished yet. Later that day, Florence explored the grounds around the chapel. Behind it, she found an overgrown garden filled with wildflowers pushing through the weeds. The fence was broken in places, and ivy climbed up the stone walls. Near the back corner, she noticed a small grave marker leaning to one side. The name had faded, but she could make out the year 1929. Someone had been laid to rest here long before her time. She knelt before it, brushing away the dirt and moss with her hand. Whoever it was, they had been forgotten by the world, but not by this place. She whispered a prayer for them, a simple one, the kind she used to say as a child. When she finished, the wind quieted, and the leaves above her stopped moving. The stillness felt sacred. She looked up at the chapel again, its roof glinting under the sun, and wondered how many souls had come here seeking the same peace she had found. That night, Florence couldn't sleep. The letter kept replaying in her mind, his handwriting, his words about grace, his promise that faith was stronger than fear. She turned the words over like stones in her hands, feeling their weight and warmth. When the candle finally burned low, she rose and walked back toward the altar. The chest was still there, the letter safe inside. Something drew her closer. The candlelight cast long shadows across the floor, and her eyes fell on the wooden boards beneath the altar where she had found the compartment. One corner looked uneven, as if another section might lift. She hesitated, then knelt again, curiosity pushing her forward. Using her hands this time, she pressed gently along the seams until she felt another hollow space beneath. She found a small latch hidden under the edge of the wood. When she pulled it, another panel lifted easily. Inside lay an old key and a faded piece of paper. The paper bore the same handwriting, Thomas's. Her heart quickened. She lifted it and read slowly under the flickering light. "The key opens the door you never dared to open. Behind it lies what I could not tell you while I lived. Trust the light that calls you." Florence stood, clutching the key. There were only 2 doors in the chapel besides the front one, the small storage room she used for sleeping, and another door near the back that she had assumed led nowhere. The key seemed made for that door. She approached it cautiously. The handle was cold, the wood worn smooth by years. Her breath came faster. The key slid easily into the lock, as if it had been waiting for her hand. With one quiet turn, the latch clicked open. The door creaked as it swung inward. Behind it was a narrow staircase descending into darkness. The air that rose from below was cool and dry, carrying the faint scent of old stone. Florence hesitated at the top of the steps, holding the candle high. The flame flickered but did not go out. She whispered softly, "I'm not afraid," though her hands trembled. Step by step she began to descend. The wood groaned beneath her weight, and the shadows grew thicker. At the bottom, she reached a small stone chamber barely large enough to stand in. The walls were lined with shelves, and on one of them rested a small wooden cross. Beneath it lay a folded piece of paper and a locket. She lifted the locket first. It was silver, tarnished by time, but when she opened it, she gasped. Inside was a lock of hair, her own. She recognized the way she had worn it years ago, braided and tied with a blue ribbon. She remembered cutting it after Thomas's funeral, leaving it on his nightstand as a symbol of letting go, but she had never seen it again. Somehow, it had found its way here. Her heart thudded in her chest as she unfolded the paper beneath the cross. It read, "This is where I kept the things that reminded me of you, not because I could not move on, but because I wanted this place to remember us when I no longer could." Florence pressed the paper to her chest, her eyes filling again. Each word deepened her sense that love had not ended with death. It had changed shape, becoming something that lived beyond touch or sight. When she climbed back up the stairs, she left the candle burning below, its glow reaching faintly through the open door. She closed it softly behind her and sat on the nearest bench, breathing slowly. The fear that once haunted her had transformed into peace. She no longer questioned why she had come here. Every sound, every whisper, every flicker of light had been guiding her toward this truth. Outside, the moon rose above the hills, silver and round. The light through the stained glass painted her face in soft colors. She thought of how Thomas's words had found her exactly when she needed them. Maybe life had been leading her here from the moment he died, one unseen step at a time. As she sat in the quiet, a warmth filled the air. It started near the altar and spread through the room like sunlight spilling over the pews. She turned her head slightly and saw it, a faint figure standing by the cross, not solid but clear enough to recognize. The shape of his shoulders, the tilt of his head. Thomas. Her breath caught, but she didn't move. He didn't speak or step closer. He only looked at her with the same calm tenderness she remembered. She smiled, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. The warmth lingered, steady and kind, until the figure slowly faded, leaving only the soft glow of candlelight behind. Florence stayed there long after, her heart full but still. The footsteps she had once feared no longer frightened her. They were no longer echoes of something unknown. They were the proof that love, once given, never truly leaves. She whispered one last time, her voice steady, "I'm home," and the chapel, as if hearing her, creaked softly in reply. Morning came gently, touching the hills with the kind of light that belongs to new beginnings. The air outside the chapel was cool and clear, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. Florence stood on the porch, holding a cup of warm tea she had made from herbs she found near the garden. The night had been long, but not heavy. Sleep had come easily after what she had seen. Her body still ached from the cold floor and long days of walking, but her heart no longer carried the same weight. Something inside her had settled. She turned her gaze toward the horizon, where fog drifted low across the valley. The world felt larger now, but also more alive. Each sound, the wind brushing the grass, a bird calling from the distance, seemed part of a gentle rhythm she had once forgotten how to hear. For the first time in many years, she didn't feel like a visitor in her own life. She felt present, rooted, quietly whole. The letter rested on the altar where she left it, and she read it again as the sunlight filtered through the colored glass. The words were as powerful as the first time she saw them. She whispered them aloud, letting her voice mix with the silence. "You must trust what is unseen and listen when the silence speaks." She smiled softly. The silence had spoken, and she had listened. As the morning unfolded, Florence decided to repair what she could of the chapel. The roof needed patching, and the steps were unsteady, but she had always been good with her hands. She found a small set of tools in an old crate behind the building, along with a few nails and pieces of wood. She spent hours working quietly, steadying boards, replacing loose panels, cleaning the broken glass that had fallen from the windows long ago. Every movement felt meaningful. She wasn't fixing just a building, she was restoring something inside herself. Each nail she drove into the wood sounded like an answer to the doubts that once haunted her. The chapel began to look alive again. The walls caught the light differently, and the faint scent of sawdust mixed with the perfume of the wildflowers she had placed near the altar. When she finished, she stepped back and admired her work. The place that had once looked abandoned now seemed to breathe again. She could almost imagine people gathering there, singing softly, their voices rising in harmony. She smiled at the thought and whispered a quiet promise to Thomas. "I'll keep this place alive." That afternoon, as she rested on the front steps, she noticed a young boy walking along the road. He looked about 10, wearing clothes too big for him and carrying a small satchel. He stopped when he saw her, uncertain whether to come closer. Florence waved gently, and after a moment the boy approached. "Are you lost, sweetheart?" she asked, her voice kind and calm. He shook his head. "No, ma'am. My grandpa's farm is down that way." He pointed toward the valley. "I just never saw anyone here before. This old chapel's been empty since forever." Florence smiled. "Not empty anymore." The boy looked around curiously. "You fixing it?" "Yes," she said softly. "I think it still has something left to give." He nodded, still staring at the building. "Grandpa says my grandma used to come here. He says she liked to pray near the window when the light came through. He says it looked like heaven." Florence's chest tightened with tenderness. "Your grandma must have had a good heart." "She did," the boy said, smiling shyly. "Her name was Rose." Florence blinked. That name was written on one of the small carvings she had seen on the wall earlier, the one next to the date, 1954. She had traced it that morning without realizing it might belong to someone real, someone connected to the land around this place. The boy's voice broke through her thoughts. "Grandpa says he might come up here again someday, maybe fix the fence." "Tell him he should," she said gently. "The world remembers people who care for the places they love." The boy smiled again, waved and started down the road. Florence watched him until he disappeared over the hill. His presence had left something behind, a reminder that the chapel story was bigger than her own. It had touched many lives before hers and would continue to after. That evening, as the sun began to fall, she lit several candles across the altar. Their light danced over the old wood, and for a moment the room looked almost holy again. She sat in the front pew and let the quiet sink in. The wind outside moved softly, brushing against the walls like a song with no words. She thought about her life before this, about the years of loneliness, about the house that no longer stood, about the faces that looked at her with pity. None of it seemed heavy now. Every wound, every loss had led her here. She understood that pain, when carried with faith, could become something sacred. The next morning, Florence walked to the nearby village. It was small, only a few houses and a general store, but the people were kind. She bought bread, milk, and a few candles. When she mentioned the chapel, the shopkeeper raised his brows in surprise. "That place up on the hill," he said. "Didn't think anyone lived there. Folks say it's haunted." Florence smiled, her eyes calm. "It's not haunted. It's just waiting for company." The man chuckled. "Well, if you can bring that place back, you'll be the first in a long time." She carried the groceries back along the dirt road, humming softly. The chapel came into view, framed by the hills and bathed in golden light. For the first time, it looked like home. When she reached the porch, she noticed something new. Near the door, where the vines had been cleared, a set of fresh footprints marked the ground. They were large, too large for the boys. Florence's breath caught. She looked around, scanning the field, but saw no one. The prints led up to the chapel door and stopped. Her hand trembled slightly as she reached for the handle. She opened the door and stepped inside. The air felt different, warmer, filled with the scent of lilies. She walked slowly toward the altar. The letter was gone. She froze, heart pounding. The wooden chest still sat in its place, but the envelope with her name was missing. Panic rose in her throat for a moment, but then she noticed something else. On top of the chest lay a single white lily and a folded piece of parchment. She reached for it carefully. The paper was new, crisp, the ink still wet. She unfolded it, her eyes scanning the words. "You kept your promise, now keep the light." No signature, but she didn't need one. The handwriting was unmistakable. It was his again, Thomas's. Her lips trembled as she whispered his name. She felt the same presence as before, steady and close. The air shimmered faintly, and a warmth surrounded her like sunlight through stained glass. The feeling lasted only a moment, but it was enough. She placed the new note back on the altar beside the lily and bowed her head. Later that day, Florence hung a small sign outside the chapel door. It read, "Open for prayer." She didn't know if anyone would come, but the act itself mattered. It was her way of saying the world still had places for hope. In the following days, people began to stop by. A farmer's wife left flowers. A traveler came to rest. A mother lit a candle for her sick child. each one left quietly but with lighter steps than when they arrived. Florence welcomed them all with a smile and warm tea. The chapel that had once been forgotten was alive again, and through every candle lit, every prayer whispered, Florence felt her husband's spirit close by, guiding her. When evening returned, she sat once more in the front pew, the candles flickering gently. The air carried a soft hum, like a hymn sung by invisible voices. She closed her eyes and whispered, "Thank you." The words weren't just for Thomas. They were for the grace that had led her here, for the second chance she never thought she'd receive. She looked toward the altar one last time that night. The lily was still there, glowing faintly in the candlelight. And behind it, faintly carved into the wood, she could now see new words that hadn't been there before. They who find love never lose it. The days passed softly after that, marked not by clocks or calendars, but by the rhythm of the wind and the flicker of the chapel candles. Florence no longer counted time in hours. She measured it by the prayers whispered inside those wooden walls, by the quiet footsteps of those who came and left with lighter hearts. Each person who crossed the chapel door seemed to carry their own kind of burden, and each one found a reason to leave something behind, a candle, a flower, a tear that fell unnoticed. The place had become alive again, breathing with stories that mixed and lingered in the air. Florence rose early every morning, sweeping the floor, lighting candles, and opening the doors before the sun reached the hills. Her movements were slow but steady. She felt purpose again, a reason to rise with the light. The locals began calling her the Lady of St. Mark's, though she never introduced herself that way. They brought her bread, blankets, and sometimes just company. Children came too, curious about the woman who had made the old chapel bloom again. They left drawings on the pews and laughed in the yard, their voices bouncing through the valley like bells. Every night before she slept, Florence read her husband's letter one more time. She had memorized every word, yet she still found comfort in tracing the letters with her eyes. Sometimes she felt him near, an unseen, calm presence that moved through the air with the same quiet certainty she had learned to trust. The chapel no longer frightened her, even when the floor creaked at night or the wind pressed against the windows. She understood that the sounds were part of the life she was keeping alive. Winter came slowly, carrying a pale stillness that wrapped the hills in frost. The villagers worried she might leave once the cold set in, but she stayed. She built small fires in a metal drum behind the chapel and warmed her hands beside it. She used the blankets people had gifted her and wore 2 coats layered over one another. The chapel stood strong through the storms, the roof now solid, the cross above it shining faintly even in the snow. One evening, a stranger appeared on the road, a man in his 60s, wearing a thick coat and carrying a walking stick. Florence noticed him from the porch as he climbed the hill. When he reached the steps, he tipped his hat politely. "Good evening, ma'am," he said, his voice low and warm. "I heard about the woman who brought this place back to life. Thought I'd see it for myself." Florence smiled softly. "It wasn't me who brought it back. It was already waiting to live again." The man nodded thoughtfully. "My wife used to pray here many years ago. She always said it was a place that listened." Florence stepped aside and motioned for him to enter. "Then it would be wrong to keep it from listening to you again." He walked slowly down the aisle, touching the top of each pew as he passed. When he reached the altar, he knelt and closed his eyes. Florence watched from the doorway, her hands folded. After a long moment, he rose and turned to her, tears shining in his eyes. "Thank you," he whispered. "You don't know what this means." She nodded, her heart swelling with quiet understanding. "Maybe I do." When the man left, he placed a small wooden carving on the bench, a dove with open wings. Florence picked it up after he was gone and smiled. Every gift left in the chapel became part of its soul. She placed the dove beside the lily on the altar. The winter deepened, but the chapel remained warm. The candles never seemed to run out, though she couldn't remember buying more. Some mornings she found them already lit when she woke, their small flames flickering peacefully. She stopped questioning how it happened. She had learned that faith didn't need explanations. One night, snow fell thick and silent across the hills. The moon shone pale over the valley, and the world looked carved from silver. Florence sat near the window, a blanket around her shoulders, watching the flakes drift past the glass. The fire burned low in the corner, and the chapel glowed with soft light. She thought of Thomas again, of how his words had guided her through the darkness. The ache of missing him never fully disappeared, but it no longer hurt. It simply reminded her of love's endurance. As she drifted toward sleep, a sound stirred her awake. It was faint at first, like a whisper under the wind. Then she heard it clearly, a low, steady hum coming from the altar. She rose, her breath fogging in the cold air, and walked slowly toward the sound. The candle flames swayed, but did not go out. The hum grew softer as she reached the altar, until it faded into silence. She looked down and saw that the lily, now dried with age, glowed faintly again. Beneath it lay a new note, smaller than the others, folded once. She hesitated before picking it up. Her fingers trembled as she unfolded the paper. The words were written in the same careful script. "You've done well. It's time to rest." She read the lines several times, her heart still. She felt no fear, only a deep peace that spread slowly through her body. She walked back to her bench and sat down, holding the note in her lap. The candlelight shimmered over her face as she smiled softly. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the ground, the porch, the steps. The chapel stood like a lantern in the white night. Florence leaned back against the pew, her eyes growing heavy. She thought of the life she had lived, of the hands she had held, of the quiet strength that had carried her here. She whispered a prayer of gratitude, her voice almost too soft to hear. When morning came, the first rays of sunlight touched the stained glass, painting the altar in color. The villagers who climbed the hill found the doors open and the candles still burning. Florence sat in the front pew, peaceful, her hands resting over the letter. She looked as though she were simply asleep, her face serene, her body wrapped in calm. Word spread through the valley, and people came to the chapel to pay respect. They spoke quietly, lighting candles and leaving flowers. The boy who once told her about his grandmother placed a small wooden heart beside her, whispering, "Thank you for bringing the light back." In time, the chapel became a place of pilgrimage. Travelers came from distant towns to see the woman who had restored faith to an abandoned house of prayer. Some said her spirit still lingered there, gentle and kind, guiding those who entered with heavy hearts. Others said that on quiet nights they could hear soft footsteps near the altar, the same ones Florence once feared but later learned to love. Years later, the townspeople placed a small plaque near the door. It read, "Florence Adams, the Keeper of Light." She found grace in silence and left peace for those who listen. And every spring, when lilies bloomed across the hills, one flower always appeared on the altar before anyone arrived. No one ever saw who placed it there, but those who believed said it was Thomas, still keeping his promise, still walking beside her where prayers never die. Thank you for joining us in this story of faith and redemption. If it touched your heart, subscribe to the channel and share it with someone who believes in second chances. Sometimes, the most incredible stories are the ones that truly happened. Years passed, and the chapel on the hill became a quiet landmark for those who wandered through the Tennessee Valley in search of peace. Seasons changed around it, like pages turning slowly in a well-kept book. Spring brought soft carpets of wildflowers that climbed toward the wooden steps. Summer filled the air with the hum of bees and the faint scent of cedar. Autumn came dressed in gold, and the trees surrounding the chapel shed their leaves like blessings upon the ground. Even in winter, when the wind swept through the valley and the sky turned pale as ash, the chapel stood firm, its cross catching every glimmer of light that managed to break through the clouds. People still came. Some traveled miles to reach it, guided by stories told at kitchen tables or whispered between neighbors at the market. They said that miracles had happened there, though no one could agree on what kind. Some claimed the sick found comfort after praying by the altar. Others spoke of seeing faint lights dancing inside the windows long after dark. No one ever found proof, but no one needed it. The chapel's peace was enough to make even skeptics linger. Inside, the air held the scent of wax wax and time. The pews had been polished smooth by years of hands resting in silence. The altar still bore the small wooden chest and the single lily, now renewed each spring by an invisible hand. The plaque near the door reminded every visitor who Florence had been. Her name had become part of the place itself, like a hymn that never lost its tune. Among those who came one early morning was the young boy who once brought his grandfather's stories. He was a man now, tall and lean, with hands shaped by labor and a calm face that carried both youth and memory. His name was Samuel, though the locals called him Sam. He had grown up hearing about Florence and how she had restored the chapel when everyone else had forgotten it. He remembered her smile, the way she spoke with gentleness that carried strength behind it. Now, years later, he felt drawn back, not just out of respect, but out of something deeper, something like a calling. When Sam pushed open the door, the hinges groaned softly, as if greeting an old friend. Sunlight streamed through the stained glass, painting his coat in colors of rose and gold. He removed his hat, stepped inside, and stood for a long moment without moving. The silence felt alive. He walked down the aisle and knelt before the altar. The lily lay there, fresh as if it had just been placed that morning. He bowed his head and whispered, "You kept the light." His voice barely rose above the quiet, but it carried through the room like a prayer. After a while, Sam stood and looked around. Dust drifted lazily in the sunlight, catching in the air like fine snow. Near the first pew, he noticed something carved into the wood that he hadn't seen before. The letters were small but clear. They read, "Those who listen will be heard." He brushed his fingers across the words and smiled. It sounded like something Florence would have said. Over the next weeks, Sam began coming back every few days. At first, he came just to sit in silence, to feel the calm that filled the air. Then he began to tidy small things, fixing loose boards, sweeping dust from the floor, replacing worn candles. The work grew naturally, almost without plan. He never meant to take on responsibility, but it happened the way seasons change, gradually and then all at once. By the end of the first month, villagers noticed the lights burning longer in the chapel at night. They found Sam there often, reading from an old Bible or writing quietly in a small notebook. When they asked if he was the new caretaker, he only smiled and said, "The chapel takes care of itself. I just keep it company." In time, Sam began keeping a journal of the people who visited. He wrote their names, their prayers, and their stories, wanting to preserve what the walls had heard. His notebook filled slowly with words that told of sorrow, hope, and gratitude. He left it on the altar each night as if it belonged to the place more than to him. Some mornings he found notes written in the margins in a handwriting that wasn't his. The words were always gentle, brief, and full of warmth. One line read, "Faith is what remains when reason sleeps." Another said, "Keep the light for those who come after." At first he thought someone from the village was adding them, but no one ever admitted to it. The mystery didn't frighten him. It comforted him. He began to see the notes as messages from the spirit of the place itself, or perhaps from Florence, whose presence seemed woven into every beam of wood and every flicker of flame. Years continued their slow procession. The valley changed with them. Roads were paved, farms grew smaller, and young people left for cities far away. Yet the chapel endured, untouched by hurry or noise. It remained what it had always been, a refuge for the weary, a reminder that even in silence, grace can be found. One stormy night, much like the one that had brought Florence there long ago, Sam sat near the window, watching the lightning cut through the sky. The rain came hard, rattling the roof, and the wind pressed against the doors. The candles trembled, but did not die. In that flickering light, Sam thought he saw a shadow near the altar, a faint, slender outline that shimmered like heat above the wood. He blinked, and the figure grew clearer. She stood with calm stillness, wearing a simple dress, her hair gathered at the back, her face soft and kind. It was Florence. Her presence filled the room like sunlight after a storm. Sam's breath caught, but he didn't move. She didn't speak, only looked at him with eyes that held gratitude and peace. Then she turned her gaze toward the lily, placed her hand above it, and the flower brightened with a soft, golden glow. When the light faded, she was gone. The chapel fell silent again, but the air remained warm, carrying the faint scent of lilies. Sam knew he had witnessed something sacred. He fell to his knees, his hands trembling, and whispered a prayer of thanks. The next morning the storm was gone. The valley shimmered under a clear sky. Sam stepped outside and the world felt newly made. He looked up at the cross, shining in the sunlight, and smiled. From that day on, he devoted his life to keeping the chapel open, welcoming anyone who needed a place to rest or pray. Decades later, when Sam grew old and his hands trembled with the years, he passed the key to a young woman from the nearby village who had begun visiting every Sunday. Her name was Clara. She reminded him of Florence in the way she spoke softly and listened before answering. He told her about the letters, the lily, and the lights that never went out. She listened without disbelief, as if she already knew such things were possible. When Sam's time came to rest, the villagers carried him to the chapel for his final farewell. The air that morning was filled with the sound of birds, and the stained glass windows caught the sunrise perfectly. As people prayed, Clara stood near the altar, holding the same old Bible that had once comforted Florence. When she looked down, she noticed a fresh lily resting on the wood, placed there by unseen hands. Years later, visitors still find the chapel unchanged. Some say the candles light themselves before dawn. Others claim that on certain nights, soft footsteps echo down the aisle, steady and calm, as if Florence and Thomas still walk together, watching over every soul who enters. The legend continues, not as a tale of ghosts, but as proof that love, once planted, grows roots deeper than time. Every spring, when the wind turns gentle and the valley blooms, the doors of St. Mark's Chapel remain open. Travelers stop by, children laugh in the yard, and someone always whispers a prayer of gratitude for the widow who once found refuge there and turned her sorrow into light. The cross above the roof still catches the sun, and the lily on the altar never fades. And if you stand quietly enough, just as the sun dips below the hills, you might hear it, the faint sound of footsteps near the altar, calm and familiar, carrying the echo of a promise kept. Time moved forward, but within the walls of St. Mark's Chapel, it always seemed to move slower, as if sacred spaces refused to age the same way people did. The wooden beams still held their warmth, the air still carried that faint scent of wax and lilies, and the sunlight that entered through the stained glass windows painted the same soft colors Florence had once seen. The chapel had become a living memory, breathing through every candle and whispering through every prayer. Clara kept her promise to Sam. She tended to the chapel with care, opening its doors at sunrise and closing them when the last streak of light faded behind the hills. She learned each creak in the floor, each mark in the pews, each pattern the sunlight made on the altar. To her, this place was not only a house of prayer, it was a heart that beat in silence. The villagers often said she had the same stillness as Florence, the same quiet strength that made people feel safe without knowing why. Under Clara's care, St. Mark's became a home for everyone. Travelers found warmth there on cold nights. Families brought baskets of food and sat in silence beside her. Children laughed in the yard, chasing each other among the tall grass. The chapel became not only a symbol of faith but of belonging. Clara never asked for donations or recognition. She only asked visitors to light a candle before leaving and whisper something they were grateful for. Soon, hundreds of candles lined the shelves, their flames flickering like countless small memories kept alive. One autumn afternoon, as Clara swept the floor, she noticed something strange. Near the altar, where the wooden boards met the stone base, a narrow crack had appeared. The light from the window touched it in such a way that it almost seemed to glow. Kneeling, she brushed her fingers across it and felt a slight warmth beneath the surface. It wasn't frightening, it was familiar, like the comfort of a heartbeat. She smiled softly and whispered, "You're still here." That night, Clara dreamed of Florence. In the dream, the widow stood by the altar dressed in pale light, her expression calm and kind. She didn't speak, but her eyes carried a message. When Clara woke, the image lingered. She felt as if she had been given something to protect, though she couldn't yet name what it was. She spent that morning in prayer, asking for understanding. The answer came quietly, not in words, but in peace. Winter returned to the valley with cold breath and silver frost. Snow blanketed the chapel roof, but inside, the warmth never faded. Clara often stayed late, reading by candlelight. On one of those nights, while the wind howled outside, she heard footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, echoing down the aisle. She looked up, her heart calm rather than afraid. The sound stopped near the altar, and the air filled with that same soft scent of lilies. She whispered, "Florence." The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was full of presence. The candle nearest the altar flared for a moment, then steadied. Clara smiled. "I'll keep the light," she said, and she did. Years went by. The village changed again. New houses were built closer to the road. The farms grew quieter, and fewer people walked long distances for prayer. Yet the chapel never closed. Clara's hair turned grey, her hands slower, but her devotion never dimmed. Sometimes, when she felt tired, she would sit near the door and watch the sunset paint the sky. She imagined Florence doing the same once, years before, feeling the same peace settle over her heart. One summer morning, a man arrived at the chapel carrying a camera and a notebook. He introduced himself as Daniel, a writer researching stories of faith in forgotten places. He had heard whispers about St. Mark's, the widow who had once lived there, the footsteps that still walked its floor, the light that never went out. Clara welcomed him kindly and offered tea. Daniel spent days listening, asking about Florence, about Sam, about the miracles people claimed to see. Clara shared what she knew, not as tales of mystery, but as truth, shaped by time. "It isn't about ghosts or miracles," she told him softly. "It's about what love leaves behind when it refuses to die." He wrote every word carefully. Before he left, he promised to return with a book so that others could know the story. Clara thanked him, then watched him disappear down the road, the dust rising behind his car. She knew that once the story reached the world, more people would find their way to the chapel. That thought made her smile. Weeks later, Daniel kept his promise. His book, The Keeper of Light, told Florence's story from beginning to end. The widow, the letter, the footsteps, and the lily that never faded. People across the state began to speak of it. Some dismissed it as legend, others swore it was real, but no matter what they believed, they came. Families, travelers, believers, and wanderers climbed the hill to see the chapel where Grace once walked in human form. Clara welcomed them all. She never corrected their version of the tale. She simply told them to sit quietly for a while, to listen. "If you stay long enough," she would say with a gentle smile, "you'll hear what you came for." As the years went on, Clara's body grew frail. Her hands shook when she lit the candles, and her steps became slower, yet her spirit remained bright. One winter evening, as snow began to fall again, she sat before the altar, the same place Florence had once rested. The lily lay fresh and white, untouched by time. Clara folded her hands and whispered, "Thank you for trusting me." The wind pressed softly against the windows, and the candles flickered in rhythm with her breath. Outside, the snow fell thicker, covering the path to the door. Inside, warmth gathered in gentle waves. As her eyes closed, she felt it again, the presence she had known for years. It surrounded her, tender and weightless, like the touch of a hand she had never seen but always felt. When morning came, the villagers found the doors open and the candles still burning. Clara sat peacefully before the altar, her face calm, her lips curved in a faint smile. The lily glowed brighter than ever, and beside it lay a folded note in the same handwriting that had once reached across time. It read, "Well done, Keeper of Light. Rest now. The flame continues." After Clara's passing, St. Mark's Chapel became more than a memory. It became a testament. Generations kept it alive, each adding something of their own, a prayer, a song, a moment of silence. The place that began as a refuge for one widow became a sanctuary for thousands. And every year, when the first snow fell, a fresh white lily appeared on the altar before dawn. No one ever saw who placed it there, and no one needed to. The people knew it was Florence, still walking the aisles, still keeping her promise, still reminding the world that faith never fades and love never ends. The story of St. Mark's Chapel stretched far beyond the valley where it stood. Photographs of its weathered cross and coloured windows began to appear in magazines and on church bulletins across the country. Travellers who had never set foot in Tennessee spoke of wanting to visit the little wooden chapel where love had once conquered loneliness. But those who came found that the beauty of the place wasn't in the building itself. It was in the feeling that greeted them the moment they walked through its doors, a peace that wrapped around them like a gentle blanket, the kind that made even the most restless soul breathe a little slower. The years turned quietly. Grass grew thick around the fences, and the trees beside the path became tall enough to touch the roof. Yet the chapel never decayed. It aged with grace, like something blessed by memory. The wooden benches still shone, the candles still burned, and the faint scent of lilies never faded. Local families took turns caring for it. Some came once a week to clean. Others brought food for the travelers who spent the night there. Each person who entered left something behind, a prayer, a song, or a moment of stillness that became part of the chapel's rhythm. One spring morning, a young woman named Elise arrived from a distant state. She had read The Keeper of Light years before and carried a copy of the book tucked under her arm. Her life had been full of loss. She had buried her mother the month before, and her father years earlier. Grief had followed her like a shadow she couldn't shake. When she read about Florence and the footsteps in the chapel, she felt a strange pull, as if the story were calling her name. She decided to come and see the place herself, hoping that the peace others found there might find her too. Elise climbed the hill slowly, the path lined with blooming wildflowers. The air smelled of rain and soil, and sunlight shimmered over the valley. When she reached the top, she stopped to catch her breath. The chapel stood quietly before her, its cross glinting like gold. She opened the door, and the soft hum of silence filled her ears. The light through the stained glass bathed the floor in color, and the air felt warm despite the cool breeze outside. She stepped inside and knelt near the altar. A single lily lay there, fresh and white, just as the book had described. She ran her fingers gently across the petals. Tears welled in her eyes, but not from pain. They came from the strange comfort of realizing that love truly could linger beyond time. She whispered softly, "Whoever you were, thank you." She stayed there for hours, reading from her book, sometimes praying, sometimes simply sitting in silence. As the day faded into evening, she heard the faint sound of footsteps moving across the back of the chapel. Her heart skipped. She turned, but no one was there. The sound came again, slow and measured, moving toward the altar. Elise froze for a moment, then smiled. She knew the story. She knew what the footsteps meant. They weren't meant to frighten. They were meant to remind. She whispered, "I hear you," her voice breaking softly. The footsteps stopped. The air filled with the faint scent of lilies. She felt something warm brush past her shoulder, gentle as breath. In that moment, she didn't feel alone anymore. Elise spent the night there, sleeping on one of the benches, wrapped in a blanket left behind by a traveler. She dreamed of a woman standing in the doorway, smiling at her with kind eyes. In the dream, the woman said only one thing: "When you leave, keep walking toward the light." When Elise woke, the words still echoed in her mind. She rose before dawn, opened the chapel door, and stepped outside. The valley below was covered in mist, the horizon blushing with the first light of morning. She stood there for a long time, her hand resting on the wooden railing, breathing in the scent of rain and earth. For the first time since her mother's death, she didn't feel the heavy pull of sadness. She felt guided, steady, ready to begin again. Before leaving, she placed her copy of The Keeper of Light on the front pew. Inside the cover, she wrote a short note: "For the next soul who needs to believe that love is stronger than loss." She smiled, closed the door behind her, and walked down the hill. Months passed. Travelers continued to arrive, and the story continued to grow. Each person who came left something of themselves behind, and each one carried something new away. One left a necklace that had belonged to her mother. Another left a photograph of his child. Some wrote letters and tucked them under the altar. No one took anything, yet everyone left changed. In the town below, people began to speak of the chapel as if it were a living friend. When storms came, the cross always seemed to catch the last flash of lightning but never fall. When droughts dried the fields, the grass around the chapel still bloomed green. Farmers said it was blessed. Children said angels lived there. The older folk said it was Florence still keeping watch. One summer a great storm swept through the valley. Thunder rolled for hours, and rain poured hard enough to flood the roads. People feared the chapel might not survive. When the skies finally cleared, they climbed the hill to see the damage. The fence was gone, and the trees were broken, but the chapel stood untouched. The candles inside were still burning. The lily on the altar remained white and perfect, not a single petal disturbed. After that storm, even those who had doubted began to believe. Pilgrims came from distant places, not for proof of miracles, but for the quiet feeling that grew inside them when they sat there. The legend of Florence spread further than any book could reach. Years later, when the wooden beams began to crack with age, the people of the valley gathered to restore the chapel. They didn't replace its weathered look or erase its old marks. They only reinforced it, keeping its heart the same. On the day they finished, they held a service. The air shimmered with golden light, and the smell of lilies filled the room. The pastor who led the prayer paused midway, glancing toward the back. He swore later that he saw a faint figure standing near the door, smiling before fading into the light. The people said it was Florence. Others said it was every soul who had ever found peace there, joining together in the silence. Whatever it was, it left behind a feeling of calm so deep that everyone in the room wept. Today, the chapel still stands. Travelers who enter say the floor creaks with the memory of footsteps, and when the wind moves through the valley, it sounds like a hymn carried by unseen voices. No matter the season, a single white lily always waits on the altar, fresh and untouched. And when the sun sets over the hills and the light spills through the stained glass, the colors form the shape of two figures standing together, one of a woman, the other of a man. Their outlines fade as the night deepens, but their presence lingers, reminding every soul who visits that love once born never disappears. Those who leave the chapel carry a piece of that peace with them. Some call it faith, some call it hope. But those who understand call it what it has always been, the light that Florence kept alive for everyone who would come after her. Decades later, the story of St. Mark's Chapel was known in distant towns and whispered in faraway churches as if it had become part of sacred folklore. Generations had come and gone, yet the little building on the hill still stood untouched by decay or neglect. Morning mist still gathered over the valley, and sunlight still broke through the clouds to touch its roof, as if heaven itself remembered where it was. People said the chapel had a heart, that its walls carried warmth even in winter, and that those who entered with sorrow left with calm they couldn't explain. Children who grew up in the valley learned its history in simple words. Their grandparents told them about the widow who had once arrived there lost and alone, about the footsteps that followed her and the letter that came from love beyond death. Teachers spoke of Florence not as a legend, but as a woman who turned pain into faith. Every person had their own version of her story, but the message was always the same. Love endures, and grace does not end with life. Elise's book had long outlived her, becoming a worn volume passed down through families. Each copy carried notes written in margins by readers who had visited the chapel themselves. Some underlined the lines that spoke of hope. Others added their own prayers on the blank pages at the back. In one edition found decades later, someone had written, "I came here broken and I left believing." Inside the chapel, the world seemed to hold its breath. The wood was darker with age, but the scent of wax and lilies remained. A new caretaker named Ruth watched over it now. She was a quiet woman, with gentle eyes and silver hair tied neatly at the back. She had grown up hearing the story of Florence from her grandmother, who had once met Clara when she was a girl. Ruth believed the chapel was more than a building. It was a bridge between what is seen and what is remembered. She tended to it with the same care others before her had shown, sweeping the floor, lighting the candles, and keeping the door open for anyone who sought stillness. One morning, a bus stopped near the base of the hill. A group of visitors stepped out holding cameras and notebooks. They had come from different states, drawn by a documentary being made about the world's quiet miracles. Ruth greeted them kindly, her voice soft but clear. "Welcome," she said. "You may take pictures, but before you leave, sit for a while. Listen, the chapel speaks best in silence." They smiled politely and followed her advice. After the filming ended, one of the visitors, a young woman named Grace, stayed behind. She lingered near the altar, looking at the single lily that rested there. "Who keeps it fresh?" she asked quietly. Ruth smiled. "No one does. It's always been here." Grace laughed softly, thinking the older woman was joking, but when she reached out to touch the flower, she felt it cold and alive, as if freshly picked that morning. She turned to Ruth, who only nodded. "Some things," Ruth said, "don't need explanations to be true." That evening, when the visitors left, Ruth sat alone in the pews, watching the light fade through the stained glass. The colors danced across the floor, changing with every movement of the clouds. She thought of all the souls who had passed through those doors, the widows, the children, the weary travelers. Each had come searching for something, and each had left carrying a spark of peace. Outside, the wind rose gently, and Ruth heard it move through the trees like a voice whispering her name. She closed her eyes and smiled. "You're still here," she said softly. The air grew warmer for a moment, filled with that unmistakable scent of lilies. She took it as her answer. In the years that followed, Ruth wrote her own account of the chapel's story. She did not try to explain the miracles or the mysteries. She only told what she had seen: the candle that never burned out, the flower that never faded, the comfort that never left. Her writings joined the long chain of words left by those before her, a legacy of faith told through time. When Ruth passed, the chapel doors stayed open. The people of the valley gathered again to care for it, each one taking turns to keep it alive. No one claimed ownership. They simply called it theirs collectively. On the anniversary of Florence's arrival, the day she first entered during the storm, they held a small service. They read her letter aloud and placed a new plaque near the altar that read, "In this house, Grace walked and chose to stay." The world around the chapel continued to change. Roads became wider, cities grew closer, and electricity reached even the most distant farms. Yet the chapel remained untouched by noise or hurry. Travelers still climbed the hill to find silence, and silence still answered them in return. One winter night, a young couple stopped there seeking shelter from the snow. They had been traveling for hours, lost after their car broke down. When they pushed open the chapel door, warmth greeted them, though there was no fire inside. They sat on the first pew, holding hands, their breath visible in the faint candlelight. The woman was expecting a child, and fear trembled in her eyes. She whispered a short prayer, her voice trembling. "Please help us find our way." The wind outside calmed, and the candles burned brighter. The man looked toward the altar, and his eyes widened. "Look," he said softly. There, beside the lily, lay a folded blanket that hadn't been there moments before. It was thick and warm, the kind made by hand long ago. They wrapped themselves in it and stayed until morning. When dawn came, the snow had stopped and the valley glowed gold under the rising sun. The couple stepped outside, amazed to find clear footprints leading down the hill, as if guiding them toward the road. They followed them and soon found help. Months later, they returned to the chapel with their newborn daughter. They named her Florence. Stories like theirs became common. People said that whenever the chapel was needed most, it gave what was asked without ever revealing how. Sometimes it was warmth, sometimes courage, sometimes the strength to forgive. No one could explain it, and no one tried. Those who visited learned that faith was not about answers, but about peace that comes when you stop demanding them. As the decades stretched into centuries, St. Mark's Chapel remained what it had always been, a sanctuary untouched by time. The paint faded, the wood aged, but the feeling never changed. Those who entered still felt watched over, still heard the faint echo of footsteps when the wind moved through the valley, still smelled lilies blooming in the cold. At sunset, when light poured through the colored glass and filled the room with gold, it was said that two faint figures could always be seen near the altar, the widow and her husband, standing together in eternal calm. And beneath them, carved into the wood for all who came after, were the words that carried the truth of their story. Love does not end, it transforms. The chapel still waits on the hill, its doors open to the world, keeping its promise. And if you ever find yourself walking those Tennessee roads, when the sky is gray and the air smells of rain, follow the winding path through the trees. When you reach the top, step inside, breathe, and listen. The silence will greet you like an old friend, and somewhere between your heartbeat and the sound of your breath, you may hear the footsteps too, steady, patient, and kind, reminding you that grace is still walking beside you. The valley never lost its habit of whispering stories. Long after the last of the original villagers were gone, people still spoke of the small chapel that time had refused to erase. St. Mark's had become a quiet symbol, not only of faith, but of the kind of endurance that comes from love too strong to fade. The land around it had changed. Fields turned into roads, barns gave way to houses, but the chapel's bell still rang softly every Sunday morning, even though no one remembered who had started ringing it again. On some mornings, mist rolled through the hills so thick that the chapel seemed to float above it like a dream. Travelers who reached the top of the hill said the air always felt different there, lighter, easier to breathe, as though the world below had forgotten to carry its worries that high. Some came to take pictures, others came just to sit in silence, yet no one ever left the same. Inside, the walls told their own story through carvings, small gifts, and the hundreds of candles that had burned over the years. There was a wooden cross carved by Sam, a silver locket left by Clara, and the book The Keeper of Light resting permanently on the front pew, its pages softened by many hands. Each object carried a piece of someone who had once come searching for peace. Ruth's handwriting still marked the altar, engraved in small letters. Grace walked here. The caretakers had changed through time, but their purpose never had. Ruth was gone now, but her niece, Hannah, had taken her place. Hannah had grown up hearing the chapel's stories, not as fairy tales, but as family truths. She knew them all by heart. The footsteps, the lily, the letter from beyond, the widow who turned her sorrow into light. Yet what amazed her most wasn't the miracles people spoke of. It was how quiet faith had managed to last for generations without needing proof. Each morning, Hannah walked the narrow path leading to the chapel, carrying a basket of fresh flowers. She arranged them near the altar, always leaving one white lily untouched. The villagers often asked how the lily stayed alive all year, and she only smiled and said, "It's not mine to explain." Her calm presence reminded people of the old days. Many said she had Florence's eyes, soft, patient, always searching for goodness in things. One evening in early autumn, a storm began to form over the hills. The wind rose sharply, and thunder rolled far away. Hannah lit candles around the chapel, closing the doors against the cold gusts. Rain began to fall, steady and heavy, the same way it had on the night Florence first arrived all those years ago. Hannah stood by the window, watching the rain run down the glass like thin rivers of light. She thought about how that single moment, one widow seeking shelter, had changed everything that came after. The thunder grew louder, and suddenly the old bell above the roof began to ring. The rope swung gently even though no hand pulled it. Hannah turned toward the altar, her heart calm but alert. The candles flickered, and a familiar scent filled the air, the smell of lilies, stronger than before. Then she heard them, footsteps, slow and steady, crossing the wooden floor. She didn't move. She knew what they meant. They weren't sounds of fear, they were reminders. The air shimmered near the altar, and a soft golden glow began to spread. From that light, two shapes appeared, vague at first, then clear enough to recognize. Florence stood beside her husband, both faces calm, both looking toward Hannah with quiet kindness. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Their presence filled the chapel with warmth so deep it felt like sunlight had replaced the air. Hannah fell to her knees, tears falling freely, not from sadness, but from awe. The figures stayed only a moment longer, then slowly faded, leaving behind the faint outline of light that clung to the altar before vanishing completely. When the glow was gone, the chapel grew still again, and the storm outside began to soften. When morning came, the valley glistened under a clear blue sky. The storm had washed everything clean, Hannah stepped outside, breathing the fresh air. On the steps, she found 2 sets of footprints side by side in the mud, leading away from the chapel toward the fields. She smiled, knowing exactly whose they were. Years later, Hannah wrote her own account of that night. She titled it The Walk of Grace. Her story closed the circle that had begun with Florence's letter so many generations before. Together, the books, letters, and testimonies formed a single thread running through time, a thread that no storm could tear apart. Today, St. Mark's Chapel still stands on that quiet hill. The doors remain open and the candles still burn. People who enter rarely speak. They sit, they breathe, and they listen. Some say they can still hear faint footsteps when the wind shifts through the rafters. Others claim that if you stay long enough, you might see 2 figures standing near the altar as the sun sets, their hands joined, their faces turned toward the light. Whether you believe the stories or not doesn't matter. What matters is the feeling that rises when you step inside, the stillness that wraps around you, the warmth that has no source, the calm that doesn't need words. That feeling is the legacy Florence left behind. It is what love becomes when it refuses to die. So if one day your road leads you through the hills of Tennessee and you see a small chapel surrounded by wildflowers, don't pass it by. Climb the path, open the door, and step inside. Sit quietly. Breathe. You might not see anything, but you will feel everything that matters. The light will touch you the way it touched her, the widow who came seeking shelter and found eternity. And when you leave, remember her story. Tell it to someone who needs to believe again, because somewhere in the hush between your words, the footsteps will walk beside you too. Thank you for joining us in this story of faith and redemption. If it touched your heart, subscribe to the channel and share it with someone who believes in second chances. Sometimes the most incredible stories are the ones that truly happened. The sun rose once more over the Tennessee Valley, gilding the hills with light as soft as memory. Morning dew clung to the blades of grass along the narrow path leading to the chapel, and the air carried the steady hum of life awakening. From a distance, St. Mark's looked almost untouched by the years, its wooden frame still standing proud, its windows still gleaming with quiet color. Only those who stepped inside could feel how full of life it truly was. Over time, the chapel had become something greater than a local landmark. It was a living chronicle of hope. Visitors from across the country came to see the place where a widow's sorrow had become the seed of something eternal. Many arrived burdened by silence, by questions without answers, by losses too heavy to name. Yet somehow they left lighter. No one could quite explain why. Perhaps it was the way the light filtered through the glass, or the stillness that seemed to listen instead of echo. Perhaps it was because everyone who entered could sense that they were not alone. By now, Hannah's story had joined the rest. Her book, The Walk of Grace, had reached the hands of people who had never heard of the chapel before. In schools and churches, readers found themselves drawn to its final chapter, the one where she described the footprints in the mud after the storm. She never said they were Florence's, but she never said they weren't. She ended with one simple sentence: "Love always leaves a path." And that sentence stayed. It was carved into the chapel's doorway years later, a promise for all who crossed the threshold. The visitors would run their fingers over the letters before stepping inside, and some would close their eyes for a moment, as if whispering a silent prayer. The walls had absorbed countless such moments, and by now they seemed to breathe. On a late afternoon, an old man arrived at the chapel. His hair was white, his walk slow but steady. In his hand he carried a small bundle wrapped in cloth. He paused by the door and smiled faintly when he saw the carved words. After a long breath he entered. The light that filtered through the glass wrapped around him like a welcome. He walked down the aisle and stopped before the altar. There, as always, lay the lily, fresh and white. The man set the bundle down carefully and unwrapped it. Inside was a faded photograph of a young couple standing before a farmhouse, smiling. He placed it gently beside the lily and whispered, "You kept your promise." He closed his eyes for a long time, breathing deeply. When he opened them again, the air in front of him shimmered faintly. For a brief instant, he thought he saw two figures standing together, their hands joined, their faces turned toward him with peace. He smiled through tears and whispered, "Thank you." Then, as quietly as he had arrived, he turned and left. That night, after he was gone, the candles continued to burn on their own. Their light glowed steady and golden, filling the chapel with warmth. The next morning, the villagers found the photograph beside the lily, and beside it lay a folded note in unfamiliar handwriting. It said, "Grace keeps walking." No one ever discovered who wrote it, but the words became part of the legend. Years later, the old road that wound through the valley was replaced by a modern highway. Many feared the chapel would be forgotten, left behind by time and speed, but it never was. Travelers still saw its cross rising above the trees and felt drawn to it, often without knowing why. Some stopped out of curiosity, others stopped because something in their hearts told them they should. Even those who claimed no faith spoke of the peace that waited there. The world around it kept moving forward, yet St. Mark's remained a pause, a place where time listened instead of racing ahead. During the chapel's centennial, the townspeople gathered for a celebration. Generations stood side by side, from elders who remembered Hannah's kindness to children hearing Florence's story for the first time. They lit candles in her honor, filling the altar with soft light. A local pastor spoke gently to the crowd. "This place stands because faith never needed proof," he said. "It only needed someone brave enough to believe." The people bowed their heads, and for a moment, silence fell like a blessing. Then, through the open doors, a breeze drifted in, carrying the unmistakable scent of lilies. No one spoke, but everyone smiled. They knew what it meant. Even now, the chapel's story continues. Every letter written, every visitor who walks its floor adds another layer to its quiet eternity. Those who come burdened with sorrow leave with the strength to forgive. Those who arrive seeking meaning find it in the stillness, and those who have lost love discover that love was never truly lost. If you ever wander through those hills and find yourself before St. Mark's Chapel, you'll see the doors open wide, as they always have been. Step inside. The floor will creak beneath your feet. The air will smell faintly of wax and flowers. Walk toward the altar, and there you will see the lily, perfect, white, alive. Touch it gently if you wish. Look toward the light coming through the window, and if you stay very still, you might hear the soft echo of footsteps, steady and kind, moving through the quiet. And if you listen closely enough, you will understand what they have always said, that some loves do not vanish. They become places, places where sorrow rests, where faith breathes, and where grace continues to walk. St. Mark's still stands, not as a monument, but as a living heartbeat of everything that cannot die. Its story began with a woman who sought shelter from a storm, but what she found became eternal. Through her courage, a letter, a single lily, and a faith that refused to end, Florence gave the world a sanctuary that outlasted her years. Her name may fade on the plaques and pages of books, but the spirit she left will not. Every candle lit in that small chapel, every tear that falls on its floor, every prayer whispered in its silence is proof that she is still there, somewhere between the light and the wind, still watching, still keeping the promise she made. And when the day comes that the last traveler leaves the valley and the chapel stands alone once more, the sun will still rise over it, and the footsteps will still be heard, because love, once given, never stops walking. Thank you for being part of this journey through Florence's story. If it reached your heart, subscribe to the channel and share it with someone who needs to believe that faith, forgiveness, and love can still transform the world. Remember, sometimes the most incredible stories are not made up at all. They are simply the truth that refused to disappear.